Greetings, friends, and welcome to our discussion on how to feed less grain with high-energy forages. At Advancing Eco-Agriculture, we have been very privileged to work with many dairy farms over the last decade, specifically working to help them increase the energy content of forages and to help them produce more milk per acre. So as many dairy farmers understand very well, when we're producing forages, particularly in grazing-based dairy operations, for a greater part of the growing season, unless it gets really dry, we generally tend to not have challenges producing adequate amounts of protein per acre. We can produce a lot of protein, very high protein content forages, and supply adequate amounts of protein in the ration without too much difficulty. This is not the case, however, when we're producing fats and when we're producing energy. So it's very difficult, or I shouldn't say difficult, but many dairies struggle to produce enough energy in their forages to supply the energy requirements of a cow for optimum production without additional supplements. As a result, many farms feed additional energy supplements either in the form of corn or other supplements that have substantial direct and indirect costs. So particularly on the organic dairy side, for right now, for example, feeding organic grain corn is a very substantial and a very direct expense. It costs a lot of money. And even on the conventional side, while the direct out-of-pocket expenses may not be so substantial, there are other costs, other indirect costs, such as reduced rumen performance, reduced digestibility of other feedstocks, and reduced cow health that result from feeding high concentrations of energy supplements such as corn in the ration. So we have been successful, as we've worked with many different dairies, in helping them grow forages with such a high energy content that the need for energy supplements goes down very substantially. And we wanted to talk tonight about how we're able to accomplish this in the field and what it is that we're looking for. In addition to corn, farmers sometimes also use other energy supplements such as molasses and other bypass fats. And these also can have some benefits. They tend to not have as substantial negative costs to a cow's health and cow's performance for the most part. So they're also an option, but they're also very expensive and can be completely replaced or very largely replaced with energy from forages. So when we look at forage energy production, usually when we think of energy in forages, the first thing that comes to mind is sugar production and the amount of sugars that are in forages. And sugars are definitely a very bioavailable source of energy in forages, but they are not the only source. The second source, which actually can contribute a substantial amount of energy, is the fat content. And producing high fat content forages is something that we've been talking about for many years. But what happens is when you have plants that have a surplus of energy, that surplus energy happens as a result of really efficient photosynthesis. And when you have really efficient photosynthesis, that gets translated, when you have a surplus of energy, that surplus energy is stored in the form of fats. The exact same thing that happens when you have high levels, or when you give an animal more energy than it requires for its own needs, it will store the surplus in the form of fats. Plants do exactly the same thing. So to accomplish these results, what we're talking about in the field, the singular emphasis from a plant nutrition management perspective is to do everything we can to increase photosynthesis, because when we increase photosynthesis, then everything else automatically flows from that. And this is what we seek to accomplish with Forage Foliar Blend, and other foliar sprays that we have put together, which are what we use to produce the high energy forages that we're talking about. So when we talk about increasing fat content in forages, we're talking about increasing the fat content. Most forages, even commercially grown forages that are relatively poor quality, will always have a minimum baseline level fat content somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1 3/4 to 2%. It generally tends to not go down below that number. In a few exceptional cases, depending on the forages, I've seen it as low as 1.5%, but it tends to not go down much below that. And the reason for that is because plants need this minimum baseline level of fats to form the cell membranes. But that fat concentration can increase substantially. We find that it's not that difficult to get the fat content to go up above 4% by using foliar nutrition to increase photosynthesis, such as the forage foliar blend. And in a number of cases, we see it go up above 5%. In really good soils, really good management, it will go up above 6%. And in a few exceptional cases, we've seen the fat content of forages go as high as 8%. So anytime, even at 4%, when you have 4% fat content, you have a substantial increase in the amount of energy that is contained within that forage over a 1.5% fat content. And the fat content in forages is measured on a forage analysis at most laboratories that conduct forage analysis, and can contribute substantially to the energy content, the NEL, net energy lactation, in a forage analysis, and in, however, even greater than the number that is reported on a forage analysis, we find that the fat content has other effects on that forage that don't necessarily show up on a test, or they may exceed what shows up on the test. So when we have these really high energy forages with high fat content, one of the things that we see happens is they become very highly digestible. So you will see that, yes, RFV numbers will increase, even RFQ numbers, which is connected to digestibility numbers, will increase. But again, what is reported on the test and what actually happens in the cows, we see that as the fat content increases, digestibility numbers increase in the rumen even more so than they do on the test. And so we're finding forages that outperform what the test results would indicate and what we would expect. I think, however, from a dairy farm management perspective, the really important, one really critical value of high energy forages is that they are the most inexpensive form of energy that we can get into a cow. So what is happening is, as we work with plants and the photosynthetic factory in plants, for a foliar application of nutrients that costs $25 to $35 per acre, depending on the nutrients that are needed and the application rates, etc., we can increase the energy content of forages anywhere from, let's just say for the sake of discussion, from 2% up to 3.5%. And that gives us a lot of fat per acre if you stop to think about the biomass, total biomass that you have out there. And there is no other form of energy that you can purchase that can come anywhere close to the low cost of energy produced in forages. Molasses is a lot more expensive, grain corn is a lot more expensive, and you can increase the energy production in those forages very substantially. However, there is something bigger than just the cost factor, and we believe that dairy farmers need to begin thinking about their total farm productivity a bit differently. So usually we tend to think of milk production, total milk production, in terms of milk produced per lactation. And there are substantial benefits in beginning to think about, instead of thinking about milk production per lactation, thinking about milk production per acre. What is the total amount of milk produced per each acre on your farming operation? So when we look at increased milk production per acre, obviously that takes many different things into consideration. It takes cow performance and into consideration. It takes feed conversion efficiency into consideration. And there's many different pieces, forage quality, forage digestibility, there's many pieces that tie into total milk production per acre. So one of the pieces that we have seen, which I want to talk about in just a moment, is how much the milk production can increase on a per acre basis when we have high energy forages as our primary source of energy. One of the additional pieces that we've observed when we have high energy forages is that we get increased butterfat content in milk. So this becomes particularly important when we're being paid on components, milk components. In some cases, depending on the forage, etc., we may also see slight protein increases, but that is not as consistent as the butterfat increases. We see fairly consistent increases in butterfat content. When we work with plant nutrition to increase photosynthesis to get greater fat content, the other thing that we observe in the field is we have a substantial reduction in insect pressure. So any challenges that we may have with insects in the field, with alfalfa weevils, leaf hoppers, whatever the case might be, we see that insect pressure in the field drop substantially as soon as we begin working with foliar applications of plant nutrients. And finally, of course, most importantly of all, we see increases in profitability. When you get increased milk production per acre, there's a very direct and very tangible line straight to the bottom line. So I wanted to talk about a few examples of farms that we've worked with and results that we have seen from working specifically with foliar applications to increase forage energy content, to increase forage fat content, and what that really means. So the first farm that I wanted to use as an example is Hidden View Farm, which is a certified organic farm that ships to Organic Valley in Fresno, Ohio, Irvin Barkman. And over the last 2 years that we have worked with Irvin on his farm, we've seen the total kind of the big picture overview of his total farming operation. I failed to mention also that since we started working with Irvin, Irvin is now 100% grass-fed. He is not feeding any additional energy supplements at all. So there is no corn being fed, and to the best of my knowledge, I don't believe there's any molasses or any other energy supplements being fed on this farm. It's 100% grass-fed. So since we've started working with Irvin, his butterfat content has increased from 3% up to an average of 4.4%. So that's a really substantial increase. When you are getting paid on components, an increase of butterfat from 3 to 4.4 is really substantial. Protein content increased from 3 to 3.5. And Irvin has also noticed that his forages grow back a lot more aggressively. So he's able to, since he is grass-fed using intensively managed rotational grazing, he's able to go back and graze his forages with a much greater intensity, much greater frequency. They grow back much stronger. He has increased his average daily milk production from 47 pounds to 50 pounds per cow per day. And also importantly, he's noticed that he has decreased and reduced forage intake. So each cow is actually consuming less forages each day, even with the increased milk production due to better forage nutrition. So he is now assigning much smaller paddocks and not grazing nearly the amount of acreage that he was initially, or putting greater number of cows per acre than what he was initially when we first started working with him. This is also something that we'll talk about a bit on our second farm, because there's been a substantial increase in cow numbers per acre on that farm. In addition, Irvin has also noticed that as his forages have become healthier and more vigorous, he has substantially reduced weed pressure, and he has almost no leaf hoppers and alfalfa weevils or any insects of any kind. Actually, he says that he has zero. He has not had any of those at all. And he has had almost no health challenges with his dairy cows. He used to have challenges with pink eye, calving challenges, and he has had no pink eye or calving issues for the last 2 years. And he's had 0 vet visits in the last 2 years on his entire farming operation. So those are costs that, while you look at his milk production numbers and 50 pounds, an average of 50 pounds per cow per day is not what an optimum production dairy might be producing, but there are other substantial costs that he does not have with no vet visits and no health challenges. Those are substantial benefits that really can improve the bottom line very, very quickly. A second farm, which has seen some really interesting things, is a farm in central Pennsylvania. Alvin Peachy. We've been working with Alvin, I believe, for 2 years as well. And Alvin started farming in 2011, and we began working on his farm in 2012. So it's actually, this is now the 4th year that we're working on Alvin's farm. And Alvin has noticed some really substantial improvements in cow performance, and he also began a really interesting experiment this last year that we wanted to talk about. But Alvin is still getting us, we hope to have more discussions later this year once we have more complete data from Alvin's farm, and we'll be updating and letting everyone know what additional things we're learning from Alvin's farm. But Alvin is running a dairy farm that is extraordinarily profitable. He is, in the words of one very esteemed dairy economist who has analyzed many different dairy operations, Alvin is one of the most profitable dairy farms that he has ever worked with or has ever analyzed. And he is an outlier in that he's very unique in the way that he's achieving that profitability. He's achieving that profitability very differently from the way many other dairy farmers approach improving profitability. So I have a few numbers that I'd like to talk about from Alvin's operation. So Alvin, the first thing that I'd like to talk about is the amount of purchased feed. So this is the feed purchases that came in off the farm. Alvin started running this farm in 2011, and in 2011, the feed costs were $1,100 per cow for the year. 2012, they went up a little bit to $1,140. He made a very concerted effort to increase milk production substantially in 2012, which is why those costs went up a little bit. 2013, they went to $1,050. 2014, $950. 2015, $950 per cow, and in 2016. These 2016 numbers are a projection, but he expects in 2016 that he will have a total cost of purchase feed of $900 per head for the year. So we see that there's a substantial downwards trend where we started at $1,100 in 2011, and now we're down to $900 of purchase feed costs per cow per year. So for the first 5 years, 2011 through the first 4 years, 2011 through 2015, those purchase feed costs were haylage, baleage, and some additional corn. In 2016, Alvin is 100% grass-fed. So he is not shipping grass-fed milk. He's not being paid for that additional work that he's doing. But he believes that there's enough economic value there for him to go 100% grass-fed, considering the energy of the forages that he's growing on his operation. So in addition to the purchase feed costs, I'd like to also look at cow numbers. So he's had a substantial increase in cow numbers. 2011, when he first started farming, he had 35 cows on this farm. 2012, he had 40. 2013, 42. 2014, 50, 2015, 55, and 2016, he has 58 cows. Now, stop and think about that for just a moment. The purchased feed costs per cow have continued to go down, and yet the cow numbers have gone from 35 to 58. The only possibility for this means that Alvin is continuing. He's producing more forage per cow on his farm today than he was in 2011 because he has less purchase feed costs. So his forage production and his total energy and protein production on his farm must have gone up substantially to be able to support that increased number of cows. If we look at the replacement heifer numbers, in 2011, he had 8 replacements. His farm produced 8 replacement heifers. 2012 and 13, it was 10. 2014, it jumped to 15. 2015, it jumped to 20. And now in 2016, right now, at the moment, Alvin has 35 replacement heifers on his farm. So not only have his cow numbers jumped substantially, but his replacement heifer numbers have jumped substantially as well. But ultimately, of course, these are good indicators. They're really valuable things to look at. But the real question is, what's the profitability? So we're still waiting on some of the exact numbers from Alvins Farm, but one of the numbers that we have been able to get is what is the total milk production per acre. So remember, the purchase feed costs have actually gone down. We started at $1,100 per acre in 2011, and we dropped $200 down to $900 per acre in 2016. $950 each of the last 2 years. But if we look at milk production per acre, in 2011, it was 4,408 pounds of milk per acre. 2012 was the year the feed costs spiked. Alvin made a concerted effort to increase milk production. That year it jumped to 7,451 pounds per acre. In 2013, milk production jumped to 8,020 pounds per acre. 2014, there was a slight dip down to 7,532. 2015, it increased to 8,315 pounds per acre. And in 2016, the first year for being 100% grass-fed, on his current trajectory, Alvin is projecting that he'll have an average of 8,000 pounds of milk per acre while being 100% grass-fed. So the milk production from 2011 was the first year that Alvin started farming. He started working with Advancing Eco-Agriculture and using foliar sprays in 2012. And in 2012, by using the foliar sprays and increasing the forage production, as well as increasing purchase feed off the farm by an additional additional $100 per cow, Alvin was able to jump milk production from 4,400 to 7,400 pounds per acre and maintain a fairly flat plateau of around 8,000 pounds per acre for the last 4 years. So to accomplish this, what Alvin has been doing in the field is using foliar sprays of forage foliar blend and putting on foliar applications after every cutting and after every grazing. And that has largely what he gives the credit to for this improved milk production per acre and improved forage production. So the total cost per acre for these foliar applications has been a total cost of an average of $150 per acre per year, all in, everything that he has done across the board. So that has been the total budget, the amount of money that he spent, and you can see he's almost doubled his total milk production from 4,400 to about 8,000 pounds per acre. So there's much more that we could talk about, but in the question and answer discussion, we'll talk about, we'll answer any questions that you guys may have about foliar applications, forage analysis. There's a number of different things that we could talk about and take it in several different directions. There's one other piece that I'd like to talk about, something that we began working with Alvin on his farm about a year ago was testing a new product formulation to improve, testing a new product that we developed to improve digestibility and improve rumen function. So I'm quite excited to announce a new product called Excite. We've announced this several different places. Some of you may have heard of it already, but we're very excited about the results that we're seeing. So Excite is a very strong digestive stimulant. It is not a microbial inoculant. It's not a probiotic that you would feed to dairy cows, but it is a very strong stimulant to enhance the rumen activity, enhance the digestive activity in the rumen. So we've been using this now on 100% grass-fed dairies. We've been using it on organic dairies. We've been using it on conventional dairies. And for the last year that we've been trialing it, we have seen an increase in pounds of milk per day, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 pounds, and an increase in butterfat content, slight increase in butterfat content on every single dairy that has trialed it. We started running trials in about September of last year on half a dozen dairies. That number gradually increased. Today, we've been running trials on about a dozen dairies altogether in several different states, and we've been able to see these increases on every single dairy that has been running the trial. The interesting part, however, is, well, farmers have been able to pay for the cost of the Excite right from increased milk production. There's a very direct and immediate turnaround. But the interesting part is what is happening with the manure that the cows are producing. So a number of the farms that have been trialing Excite, particularly over the winter months, have liquid manure pits and are using liquid manure systems. And what they have, every single one reported that as soon as they began feeding the Excite, within a matter of days, their liquid manure pit began frothing and foaming and fermenting and digesting very quickly, and they had no sludge and no solids of any kind in their liquid manure pit. So it is apparent that however we're increasing the digestibility and the digestive system in the rumen, the other piece that is happening is that is flowing through, coming out the back end, and that cannot help but have a substantial impact on the microbial activity in the soil as well. So we have not observed this effect at any time before with any other probiotics that we have worked with, and we're very excited by the possibilities of working with Excite. So we have just launched this product, we've just released it, and if any of you have any interest, we'd definitely like to work with you and conduct a trial in your operation. So one last piece that I want to talk about just a little bit, and this is the question of, we talk about increasing the energy content of forages. How do we actually do that? I've talked about this quite frequently, and I'm sure that many of you who have listened to seminars and presentations are probably familiar with this, but it's still a very important question to answer just briefly. And very simply, very fundamentally, what happens is using foliar sprays and using nutrients applied to a plant foliage only has one very singular purpose, and that purpose is to increase the photosynthesis of every leaf in every 24-hour photo period. A foliar spray needs to increase photosynthesis. So each leaf of most forages, depending on its nutritional integrity and the amount of carbon dioxide available and water and etc., a whole number of other factors, it is very common for the leaves of most forage crops to produce somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 30% of their total sugar production that they could produce in every 24-hour photo period. So it's possible to increase the number of sugars produced by each leaf by a factor of 3 to 4 times. And that, of course, in order for that to happen, we need to have adequate sunlight, we need to have adequate water, we need to have adequate carbon dioxide, and we need to have the right nutrition. Most commonly, we find that the proper nutrition is the greatest limiting factor. So when we put on foliar applications, the intent is to increase the photosynthesis, and that photosynthesis increases the number of fats produced, increases the number of sugars produced, and when you have a surplus of those surplus sugars get stored in the form of fats. And that's really how you increase the fat content of forages. So, and it's also how you increase yield and total production and total tonnage per acre as well. So this is an example of the power of foliar applications that I want to talk about very briefly. This is a story of a farm in central Pennsylvania, a farmer that we had been working with for several years that relocated to a new farm. And when he purchased the new farm, there was an established field of alfalfa that was 1-year-old alfalfa and lacked vigor. It wasn't really healthy, didn't really have a lot of spark, and he was was considering not even keeping that stand of alfalfa, but we looked at it and suggested that he keep it and work with it to see if he could improve the total vigor of that stand. So we conducted soil analysis, and we made a recommendation for a combination of different soil amendments, compost, limestone, gypsum, rock phosphate. There were a number of different soil amendments that were applied and that were broadcast over the entire field. And then the field was split into 3 different pieces. The first section, got a foliar application after the first cutting. A second section got a foliar application after the first and after the second cutting. And a third section served as a control, an untreated control, with no foliar applications. All 3 sections got the soil application that was broadcast, but they got differing amounts of foliar applications. Now, the 2 leaves that you see here, in the first leaf is much larger, much darker green, and this is a leaf from the section that got a single foliar application. The second leaf is from a section that got a double foliar, or that got no foliar application. You can see there's some very substantial differences in leaf size, leaf shape, and leaf color, etc. And you look at these, you say, well, that's 2 leaves, right? You can fudge that. But what happens when you look at the entire plants? So here, the plants on the left, we have an untreated control. We have that with got a single foliar, and we have the double foliar with a soil amendment applied. So there's very substantial differences in leaf to stem ratio and total leaf size. And when you look at this, we could talk some more about this example, but what I wanted to point out is the total yield numbers. So these are yields for just the third cutting by itself, not counting the first and second cutting. On the third cutting by itself, the untreated control produced 3/4 ton per acre of hay. The section which had a single foliar produced 1¼ tons per acre, and the section with a double foliar produced 1½ tons per acre. So you have a total spectrum range from 3/4 ton per acre all the way up to 1½ tons per acre. And those 2 foliar applications cost $35 per acre per application. So there was a total cost of $70 per acre for an additional 3/4 ton of alfalfa production. And that was not, of course, giving any consideration to the improved quality, the improved digestibility, and everything else that was happening with those forages. The really important part also, of course, to consider is that not only did we have increased biomass production, increased yield, but how much that increased sugar production and sugar translocation out through the root systems, and how much that improved soil biology. So there's more pieces that we could discuss, but I'll leave those to your questions, and we'll respond to those. So the important question, however, is what is it that you want to see? What is it that you want to accomplish on your farm? If you really want to improve the total energy production, want to improve milk production per acre and improve profitability in the same way that some of these farms are that we're working with, then we would be happy to work with you to use and begin putting foliar recommendations together for your farm. We believe very strongly that foliar applications on forages are the shortcut to success. They are the least expensive and most productive way to rapidly increase sugar production and to increase total yield and total production per acre. We look forward to working with you to deliver.
Thank you, John. And now for questions and answers. If you have not put your questions into the questions and answers section, go ahead and do so now, and we'll answer those questions as we go. We do have a couple of questions, John. And I also saw somebody had raised their hand. If you would just, it's not raised anymore. So if you have questions, please put them in the question and answer section, and they will show up here. All right, so 4 questions, John. We will start with the question from Liam Jambers. And he says that he missed the first part of the webinar. So he's asking about our products. Are they fungi based? Can you just talk a little bit about what makes our products unique?
So the materials that we put together are, we call them plant nutritional supplements, and you can think of them almost as being vitamins for plants. So they specifically are nutrient supplements such as chelated manganese and magnesium and iron, etc., including cobalt, molybdenum, and all these various trace minerals that are particularly formulated to increase a plant's rate of photosynthesis. So we particularly target all the elements and all the enzyme cofactors that are needed to increase a plant's photosynthetic rate. So they are, you could primarily think of them as nutritional supplement products, nutrient products, not as microbials. So they tend to enhance biology. They enhance both fungal and bacterial growth in the soil profile, fungal growth in particular, but they are not a fungal inoculant and they're not a fungal digestive product.
Great, excellent. The next question we will take is, are there any long-term measurements of soil organic matter in the soils, say over a 10-year period from the use of your products, which we're not here for 10 years yet, but we do have some results. So go ahead.
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that we actually have put some other webinars together on, I think they're on YouTube that you can find them as well, is where we talk about what we call carbon induction and how to very rapidly sequester carbon and build soil organic matter. So there are 3 ecosystems which sequester carbon much faster than almost any other, than by comparison to other ecosystems. They're kind of the 3 leaders. The first is a young growth, an early growth coniferous forest, evergreen forest. The second is a perennial polyculture of grasses and legumes, etc., that is being grazed with intensively managed rotational grazing. And the third is with corn production. Those 3 plants or plant ecosystems sequester carbon and build soil organic matter faster than any others when they are given the right nutrition, supported with the right nutrition, particularly for corn production, particularly for the perennial polyculture grazing systems. So we do not have 10-year data, but we do have 1-year, 2-year, 3-year, 5-year data, and all of that data is quite extraordinary. An example is a corn farmer that we worked with in Kansas last year, organic corn farmer. This farmer has been growing cover crops and growing corn in a rotation for a number of years in a dryland environment under irrigation, and has not been successful in building organic matter. His organic matter levels when we started working with him were 1 3/4%. And from spring to fall in one growing season, actually it would be from spring to the following spring is when the soil samples were taken. But in a single growing season, the organic matter increased from 1 3/4 to 2.5%. So we gained a 3/4 percentage point in a single year. And that was with the organic matter being properly digested and not a lot of raw material on the soil profile. So we see substantial jumps, very rapid jumps in soil organic matter when we build nutrition into the plant and allow them to sequester a lot of sugars and move a lot of sugars out through the root systems as root exudates.
Excellent. Next question is, the benefits that you talked about on milk yield, do they include silage, haylage crops that are consumed during the winter?
Yes, they do. So when we talk about milk yield per acre, that is a total number over the entire farm, and that includes all of the grain corn, the corn silage, everything that farm is producing. And it also includes, we're basically just looking at the total milk number. What is the milk number that was shipped, and what is the farm acreage? So then you also have to take into consideration the amount of purchased feed. So if you are just purchasing the majority of your feed, then obviously you can really inflate that number. But in the case of the example that I was talking about with Alvin Peachy, his purchase feed costs were actually dropping and going down while his milk production per acre was increasing, and that's the really important number.
Okay, good. There's two questions here, one from Paul and one from Vale, that I think you can maybe answer together. Paul asked, what's your experience, what are your experiences are the most common micronutrient issues you're addressing? And then Vale is asking, what is needed in the midterm when your plants are making higher sugars and yet not raising the fats, or when animals are getting too much sugars, do you need to supplement fats? So basically he's asking, when your plants are making higher sugars, but it's not being converted to fat, what are we missing there? And maybe you can answer both questions at once there.
Okay, so the first question, which is, what are the most common trace mineral deficiencies that we are seeing? It's actually, the answer to that question has surprised us as we've continued to do more research and have gained a lot of field experience. The ones that we expected to see being deficient were not the ones that we're seeing being deficient. So speaking purely in terms of energy production and photosynthesis, there are 5 nutrients that we pay very close attention to constantly because of their role in photosynthesis. Magnesium being the first, being the center ion of the chlorophyll molecule. Iron for its role in synthesizing chlorophyll and other carotenoids that are a part of the photosynthetic process. Manganese for its role in splitting the water molecule in water hydrolysis so that photosynthesis can happen. And so those are the big 3 directly involved with photosynthesis are magnesium, iron, and manganese. And then in addition to that, not directly involved in photosynthesis, but involved in energy transfer is phosphorus and sulfur for protein synthesis. So the 2 trace minerals, there are 2 minerals that we see showing up deficient in 95% of the crops that we work with. And those 2 are manganese and iron. Now, manganese is not a big surprise because we generally tend to have higher levels of manganese in many soil profiles, but it tends to be in the oxidized form in a form that plants can't utilize. However, iron did come as a surprise because when we're working with soil analysis and when working with forage analysis, iron levels are always high. We always get iron levels showing up as being really high, and almost in 99% of the test reports that come back. When we began using sap analysis, we discovered that the iron these plants were absorbing that was showing up in the forage analysis was actually in the form of oxidized iron, in a form that was not physiologically active. And the form of irons that plants could use, the reduced form, a quadruple positive, was actually deficient. And we got a tremendous crop response every single time we apply iron. So we pay a lot of attention to iron and manganese, and we get a very strong crop response when we address those in our foliars. And I would say those are the 2, in terms of yield and production and energy production, those are the 2 that are the most common that we see deficient. And of course, we also pay attention to molybdenum and other trace minerals, but so the short answer to the question is the 2 that we see the most deficient most commonly are manganese and iron. Then the second question, what is happening when you have high sugars, but you have a low fat content? And there's several things that can be happening there in terms of plant physiology. The one possibility that can happen when you have low levels of phosphorus. So on a forage analysis, for most forages, you'd want the phosphorus content to be 0.35% or greater. And when the number is substantially less than that, particularly below 0.3, it is possible to have an accumulation of sugars, but the plant doesn't have enough phosphorus to metabolize those sugars and convert them into fats. So that's one possibility of what could be happening. A second possibility, with probably a greater degree of probability, is when you have low sulfur. There is a direct correlation between sulfur nutrition and oil content, fat content. In many cases, we see crops that do produce enough sugars, but they don't convert those sugars into oils because they don't have enough sulfur. So if you're having that problem, I would say, obviously we have to make sure that we don't have any other glaring deficiencies in other areas, but you address phosphorus and address sulfur, and you're very likely to see your fat numbers increase.
Excellent. And then there's a question, can you discuss the management needed when the Brix is high, but the plants are not yet fully mineralized? And maybe that's just a repeat of that last comment.
Well, if it's very related. It relates to the sugar. What is happening when you have a really high Brix reading, but the plants aren't healthy, what is happening is that you have an accumulation of sugars in the leaves, and that accumulation of sugars is not being metabolized properly. So there's two pieces that need to happen. First, when you look at total sugar production, you need to think of sugar production in terms of a 24-hour photo period. So you have photosynthesis peaking during daylight hours when the sunlight is shining. And then in the late afternoon, evening, those sugars need to begin being processed and transported to the sugar sinks. So what should happen is you should have a substantial sugar drop. Whatever the sugar content, the Brix reading is in late afternoon, that number should drop by about 65 to 70% by the next morning at 6 a.m. And so that sugar needs to move out of the leaves and move down into the root system and up to the new growth and be fully metabolized. If that is not happening, there's several possibilities. And I actually talk about this in our SAP analysis training seminar of how to evaluate sugars. But the two most common possibilities would be, as I mentioned earlier, you don't have enough phosphorus to properly metabolize the sugar and convert it to energy so that the plant can use it as a growth energy. The second possibility is that when you have a boron deficiency, the sugar does not move out of the leaves down into the root system or up to the new growth very well. So it can also be caused by a boron deficiency. And sometimes in fruits and vegetables, it can also be caused by a potassium deficiency, but that's hardly ever likely to be the case in forages.
All right, next question's a short one. Have any dairy goat farms used this program?
Yes, we actually work with several dairy goat farms in Pennsylvania.
All right, and the principles hold true. There is another example, or there's another question, not example. The example of the corn that you gave with the 1% increase in organic matter, was that the same corn in the second year when the soil organic matter increased from 1% from one year to the next?
I'm not following the question.
So this corn example was the same crop, maize, in the second year when the soil organic matter increased 1 year. In other words, was it corn on corn?
Was it corn on corn? Well, the soil sample was from spring to spring, so there was that jump in organic matter happened while there was a corn crop year, while we were growing corn. I'm actually not certain whether, I don't believe it was corn that following year.
You're talking about, if you're talking about Brad Kane, then it was fallowed wheat the year before, and he planted a cover crop in the spring and then planted corn on our program. And then when he took the next sample, it was actually, I think it was fall to fall soil samples.
Oh, got it. Yeah, great, David. You were the one working with him, so you would know.
Yep. Have any grass-fed beef producers used this?
Oh, quite a number. We work with many grass-fed beef growers, dozens of them.
And then there's a question. Seems like all this info would be applicable with any grass, lawns, golf course, and so forth. Would it be wonderful to get the homeowners off chemicals and pesticides? Any comment?
Yes, two comments. Number one, it is very easy to manage grass growth in lawns with nutrition. You can make it very dark green. You can keep it short and keep it from growing nearly as vigorously. If you manage nutrition well, you don't need the intense nitrogen applications. you can make do with less water. So the principles absolutely apply to turf grass production or something like that. So the nutrition management part is easy. What is a little bit less easy is the weeding part. So many homeowners are using chemicals primarily for weed control. And so we haven't yet mastered the perfect nutritional solution to manage all the weeds at this point.
Okay, good. We're getting up to actually a little bit past 1 o'clock. We have one more question here that I think you could quickly comment on, and they're really rolling in now. We might not have time for everybody. You mentioned about gypsum and limestone being applied together. Surely gypsum and limestone will neutralize each other. What are your thoughts on that?
No, they won't necessarily neutralize each other, depending on soil chemistry and how, and in effect, I mean, the question really is, what does it matter if they do neutralize each other? If you have an acid and an alkaline reacting with each other, that means the calcium contained in both of them is going to release. So in terms of crop performance, there is only positives to be gained from applying them together. But it's not something that we do as a routine matter, of course. We do it in exceptional cases where we have exceptional biochemistry. We don't do it all the time. Usually it's either one or the other.
Correct. All right, very good. That answers all of our questions. It brings us exactly to 1 o'clock. Well, exactly 3 minutes over, so that's pretty close. So we will conclude the call there unless you, John, have something further to add.
I don't have any further comments. Thanks everyone for being on the webinar. I hope that you found it productive and helpful and enjoyable. And we look forward to working with you on your operations. We have a lot of fun, and we're sure that you will too.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
you have a wonderful day.
Bye.